He sat in his wheelchair, forgotten and confused, while nurses treated him like a burden. Everyone thought Alzheimer's had stolen his mind. But when a young caregiver finally heard his stories, she realized she was caring for one of America's greatest war heroes. Veterans and military families, share your hero's name and one story they told you. Let's make sure no Walter Harrison is ever forgotten again. Their stories matter, and so do they. Walter Harrison occupied room 347 at Sunset Manor Nursing, home in Springfield, Missouri, where he'd lived for the past 2 years. At 85 years old, he was what the staff diplomatically called a challenging resident, and what they said among themselves was, "That old guy who never shuts up about wars." Every morning started the same way. Walter would wake at 05:00 hours, though he no longer remembered why he called it that, and begin talking to whoever would listen about places with names like Da Nang, Khe Sanh, and Heartbreak Ridge. The stories flowed out of him in fragments, disconnected pieces of what the staff assumed were delusions created by a deteriorating mind. We were pinned down for 3 days. Walter would tell the morning nurse as she checked his blood pressure. Charlie had the high ground, but we held that ridge. Lost good men, though. Good men don't come back. The nurses had learned to nod politely and change the subject. Dr. Patricia Webb, the facility's medical director, had explained Walter's condition to the staff during orientation. Advanced Alzheimer's disease with frequent confabulation, the creation of false memories to fill gaps left by the disease. Mr. Harrison's military fantasies are common in male patients with dementia. Dr. Webb had said, they often imagine themselves as war heroes. It's his mind's way of maintaining dignity as his cognitive function declines. Just be patient and redirect when possible. The morning shift nurses, experienced professionals, who had seen it all, treated Walter with the kind of detached kindness reserved for patients who would never get better. They checked his medications, helped him with meals, and endured his endless stories about battles that seemed too elaborate to be real. He claims he was in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Charge nurse Sandra Morrison complained during a staff meeting. The man would have had to serve for 30 years to be in all those conflicts. It's impossible. The afternoon shift was less patient. By 3 p.m., when Walter typically became more agitated and talkative, the staff had heard enough war stories to last a lifetime. They would wheel him to the common area and turn up the television to drown out his voice. "He's attention-seeking," said Linda Peters, a nursing assistant with 15 years of experience. "These old-timers watch too many war movies and then think they live them. Best thing is to just not engage." Walter's family rarely visited. His son Robert lived in California and called once a month, usually speaking to the nurses rather than his father. "How's his condition?" Robert would ask. "Is he eating? Taking his medications?" He never asked about the stories his father told, having long ago dismissed them as symptoms of the disease that was slowly erasing the man he remembered. The other residents at Sunset Manor gave Walter a wide berth. His constant talk of war and death made them uncomfortable during their bingo, games, and afternoon socials. They preferred the quiet residents, who watched television peacefully or slept in their chairs. "He scares the other patients," complained Mrs. Dorothy Chun, whose husband shared Walter's table in the dining room. Yesterday, he was talking about bodies and blood during lunch. "Can't you make him stop?" The staff tried different approaches. They moved Walter to an isolated table, hoping the physical distance would contain his stories. They increased his anxiety medications, thinking chemical intervention might quiet his memories. They even tried engaging him in other activities, art therapy, music programs, group discussions about current events. Nothing worked. Walter continued to live in a world of military operations and fallen comrades, speaking to people who weren't there and reliving battles that the staff assumed existed only in his fractured mind. The breaking point came during the third week of November, when a local high school class visited Sunset Manor for a community service project. The teenagers were there to read to residents and help with activities, earning volunteer hours for graduation requirements. Walter immediately latched on to the young visitors, seeing them as a fresh audience for his stories. As 17-year-old Jessica Martinez sat down to read him a magazine article, Walter interrupted with his usual intensity. "You remind me of a nurse in Da Nang," he said, his watery blue eyes focusing on Jessica with surprising clarity. "Lieutenant Sarah Collins. She was about your age when she saved my life. Took shrapnel in her back getting to me during the Tet Offensive." Jessica looked around nervously, unsure how to respond. The staff had warned the students about residents with dementia and coached them to redirect conversations away from inappropriate topics. "That's nice, Mr. Harrison," Jessica said, opening the magazine. "Would you like me to read about this recipe for apple pie?" But Walter wasn't finished. Sarah died 2 days later. Infection set in from the shrapnel wounds. She could have gone home, could have lived, but she stayed to help wounded soldiers. Gave her life for men she barely knew. Jessica felt uncomfortable with the graphic details, but something in Walter's voice made her pause. The way he spoke about this Sarah, there was a specificity, an emotional weight that didn't sound like fantasy. "I tried to get her a Purple Heart," Walter continued, his voice breaking slightly. "Command said nurses didn't qualify back then. Said her sacrifice didn't count the same way. But it counted to me. It counted to the 12 men she saved before she died." The charge nurse noticed the student's distressed expression and intervened quickly. "Mr. Harrison, that's enough war talk for today," Sandra Morrison said firmly, guiding Jessica away from his wheelchair. "Let's let this young lady read her magazine in peace." Later that day, Sandra filed an incident report recommending that Walter be restricted from interacting with visitors. Patient continues to share inappropriate war fantasies that disturb guests and other residents. She wrote, "Recommend limiting social interactions to essential care only." But Jessica Martinez couldn't stop thinking about the way Walter had spoken about Lieutenant Sarah Collins. That evening, she mentioned the conversation to her grandfather, a Vietnam veteran who lived nearby. "Grandpa," she said, "do you know anything about nurses getting killed in Vietnam? Specifically someone named Sarah Collins?" Her grandfather, Miguel Martinez, looked up from his newspaper with interest. "Why do you ask, Mia?" Jessica described her conversation with Walter, expecting her grandfather to dismiss it as the ramblings of a sick old man. Instead, Miguel's expression grew serious. "Sarah Collins," he repeated slowly. "Jessica, where did you hear that name?" "From this old man at the nursing home where I'm volunteering. He has Alzheimer's and tells a lot of war stories. The staff says they're all made up." Miguel was quiet for a moment, then disappeared into his bedroom. He returned carrying a worn photo album and sat down beside his granddaughter. "Mia," he said gently, "I knew Sarah Collins. She was a real person, and she really did die in Vietnam, saving wounded soldiers." He opened the album to a page of faded military photos and pointed to a picture of a young woman in Army fatigues standing next to a field hospital. "That's her," Miguel said. "Lieutenant Sarah Michelle Collins, Army Nurse Corps. She was killed during the Tet Offensive in February 1968. Exactly like your old man described." Jessica stared at the photograph, feeling a chill run down her spine. But the nurses said his stories are all fake. They said people with Alzheimer's make up memories." "Some do," Miguel agreed. But Jessica, if this man knew Sarah Collins, if he was there when she died, those aren't fake memories. Those are real ones, probably the most important memories of his life. Miguel closed the album and looked at his granddaughter seriously. What's this man's name? Walter Harrison. He says he was in 3 different wars, which the staff says is impossible. Miguel was quiet for a long moment. Jessica, I need you to find out everything you can about Walter Harrison. If he really knew Sarah Collins, if he was there when she died, then he's not just some confused old man telling stories. He's a witness to history. The next day, Jessica returned to Sunset Manor with a new purpose. Instead of trying to redirect Walter's stories, she decided to listen, really listen, to what he was saying. She found him in his usual spot by the window, staring out at the parking lot with unfocused eyes. When she sat down beside him, he turned to her with a slight smile. "You came back," he said softly. "Most people don't come back once they hear the stories." "I want to hear more about Lieutenant Collins," Jessica said carefully. "My grandfather knew her. He said she was real." Walter's entire demeanor changed. His eyes sharpened, his posture straightened, and for a moment, Jessica could see the shadow of the man he had once been. "Your grandfather was in Vietnam?" Walter asked. "Yes, sir." "Miguel Martinez, 1st Infantry Division." Walter nodded slowly. "The big red one, good unit. Professional soldiers." He paused, studying Jessica's face. "If your grandfather knew Sarah, then he knows she deserved better than she got. They all deserved better." "Tell me about her," Jessica said gently. Walter's voice took on the same emotional weight she'd heard the day before. "Sarah was from Iowa, small town, farm family. She joined the army because she wanted to help people, not because she wanted to be a hero. But when the shooting started, when men were dying, she became one anyway." He stared out the window, but Jessica could tell he was seeing something else entirely. "February 31st, 1968, Walter continued. "That's a date I'll never forget, even with this disease eating my brain. The North Vietnamese hit us hard during Tet, coordinated attack on 3 positions simultaneously. We had wounded everywhere. And Sarah just kept moving from man to man, keeping them alive under fire." Walter's hands shook slightly as he spoke, but his voice remained steady. "I took shrapnel in my legs and couldn't move. Sarah crawled 50 meters through enemy fire to reach me, dragging medical supplies. She stopped my bleeding, gave me morphine, told me I was going to see my family again." Jessica felt tears forming in her eyes as Walter continued. "She could have stayed with me, could have waited for the shooting to stop. Instead, she went back for others. Saved 12 men that day before a mortar round caught her. Died 3 days later in a field hospital, never knowing if the men she saved made it home." Walter turned to look directly at Jessica, his eyes clear and focused. "I made it home because of her. Had a career, a family, 60 years of life. I wouldn't have had if Sarah Collins hadn't risked everything for a soldier she barely knew. And now I'm the only one left who remembers her name." Jessica sat in stunned silence, realizing that what the staff had dismissed as dementia-induced fantasy was actually the testimony of a man who had witnessed extraordinary courage and sacrifice. "Mr. Harrison," she said quietly, "what else do you remember? About the wars? About the people you served with?" Walter smiled sadly. "Everything, child. I remember everything. The disease takes my recent memories. What I had for breakfast, what day it is, sometimes even where I am. But the war memories, those are burned in too deep. They'll be the last thing I lose." That evening, Jessica called her grandfather and told him everything Walter had shared. Miguel listened in growing amazement. then made a request that would change Walter's life. "Jessica," he said, "I want you to ask Walter about something specific. Ask him if he remembers a place called Hill 881 South, and ask him if he knew a Marine named James Mitchell." "Why, Grandpa?" "Because James Mitchell was my best friend in Vietnam, and he died on Hill 881 South. If Walter Harrison was there, if he knew Jimmy, then we're not dealing with a confused old man. We're dealing with a war hero who's been forgotten by everyone except his own memories." The next morning, Jessica arrived at Sunset Manor earlier than usual, her mind racing with questions. She found Walter in the dining hall, slowly eating breakfast while the staff bustled around him, with their usual efficient indifference. "Mr. Harrison," she said, sitting down across from him, "I have a question from my grandfather." Walter looked up from his oatmeal, his eyes taking a moment to focus on her face. "Your grandfather has questions for me?" he asked. "He wants to know if you remember a place called Hill 881 South, and if you knew a Marine named James Mitchell." The effect of those words on Walter was immediate and profound. His spoon clattered into his bowl. His hands began to shake, and tears formed in his eyes. "Jimmy Mitchell," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "God help me, I remember Jimmy Mitchell." Jessica leaned forward, her heart pounding. "Tell me about him." Walter closed his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 55 years of grief. Jimmy was 19 years old, from Boston. He had a picture of his girlfriend Mary that he showed everyone. She had dark hair and a smile that could light up a room. Jimmy was going to marry her when he got home. Walter opened his eyes and looked directly at Jessica. Hill 881 South was a nightmare. March 1968. Just after Tet, the North Vietnamese had fortified the hill, and command decided we needed to take it. 3 days of fighting, 3 days of hell. He paused, struggling with memories that were clearly as vivid as if they had happened yesterday. Jimmy's platoon was pinned down on the north slope. Heavy machine gun fire from concealed positions. They couldn't advance, couldn't retreat. I was a captain then, had to make a decision. Walter's voice became stronger, more authoritative, as if the act of remembering had temporarily restored his military bearing. I took 2 squads and flanked the enemy position. 15-minute firefight, but we neutralized the machine gun nest. When we reached Jimmy's platoon, Walter's voice broke, and Jessica waited patiently for him to continue. Jimmy had taken a round through the chest, punctured lung, probably hit his heart too. He was conscious, but fading fast. No way to get a medevac up that hill with all the incoming fire. Walter looked at Jessica with eyes that had seen too much. I held that boy while he died, 19 years old, and he used his last breath to ask me to tell Mary that he loved her. Made me promise to find her, to let her know he was thinking about her at the end. Jessica felt tears running down her cheeks. "Did you? Did you find her?" "After the war, yes. Took me 2 years to track her down. She'd moved to California, was working as a teacher. I told her what Jimmy said, gave her his dog tags and the picture he carried of her." Walter smiled through his tears. "She cried for an hour, but she thanked me. Said knowing that Jimmy loved her at the end helped her heal. She got married eventually, had children, lived a good life. But she never forgot Jimmy Mitchell." Jessica sat in stunned silence, realizing that she was hearing firsthand testimony about events that had shaped American history. When she looked up, she noticed that several staff members had stopped their work and were listening to Walter's story. Sandra Morrison, the charge nurse, approached the table with a confused expression. "Mr. Harrison," she said hesitantly, "how do you remember all these details? The dates, the names, the specific circumstances?" Walter looked at her with the patient expression of someone explaining something obvious to a child. Nurse Morrison, when you hold a dying 19-year-old in your arms, when you promise a dead boy's mother that you'll make sure he's buried properly, when you carry the guilt of survival for 55 years, you don't forget the details. You can't forget them. Sandra's expression softened, and for the first time since Walter had arrived at Sunset Manor, she really looked at him, not as a difficult patient with dementia, but as a human being with a story worth hearing. "Mr. Harrison," she said quietly, "what rank were you when you retired?" "Colonel," Walter replied simply. 27 years of service. 3 wars, 4 Purple Hearts, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Silver Star. Sandra felt something cold settle in her stomach as she realized what they had done, how they had treated a decorated war veteran like a burden, dismissing his most precious memories as delusions. "Sir," she said, using the title of respect for the first time, "I owe you an apology." But Walter shook his head gently. "No apology necessary, Nurse Morrison. You didn't know. Most people don't want to know. The stories are hard to hear, harder to believe. It's easier to think they're just the ramblings of a sick old man." Jessica's grandfather arrived at Sunset Manor that afternoon, having driven straight from his home after Jessica's phone call. Miguel Martinez was a small, dignified man in his 70s, wearing a baseball cap that identified him as a Vietnam veteran. When he saw Walter sitting by the window, Miguel stopped in his tracks. Though they had never met, something in Walter's bearing, even diminished by age and disease, spoke to the shared experience of men who had served in impossible circumstances. "Colonel Harrison?" Miguel said, approaching Walter's wheelchair. Walter looked up, his eyes taking a moment to focus, then widening with recognition of a fellow veteran. "You must be Jessica's grandfather," Walter said. "She tells me you knew Jimmy Mitchell." Miguel nodded, pulling up a chair beside Walter. "Jimmy was my best friend in Vietnam. We served together in the 1st Infantry. I was there when we got word that his platoon had been overrun on Hill 881 South." Walter's expression grew pained. "I'm sorry you lost your friend. He was a good Marine, died like a hero." "Colonel," Miguel said gently, "I've spent 55 years wondering what happened to Jimmy on that hill. The official reports were classified, and the men who survived were scattered to different units. I never knew the details." Walter nodded slowly, understanding what Miguel was asking for. "Your friend died in my arms," Walter said simply. "He wasn't alone. He wasn't forgotten. And his last words were about going home to the girl he loved. If that brings you any peace, then I'm glad I lived long enough to tell you." Miguel felt tears running down his face as Walter continued. "Jimmy saved 3 men that day before he was hit, carried wounded soldiers to cover under heavy fire, went back for ammunition when his squad ran low. He earned his death, if that makes sense. He died like a soldier." The 2 veterans sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sharing the weight of memories that civilians could never fully understand. "Colonel," Miguel said finally, "my granddaughter says the staff here thinks your stories are fantasies caused by your condition." Walter smiled sadly. "The Alzheimer's is real, Miguel. I can't remember what I had for breakfast or what day of the week it is. But the war memories, those are burned in too deep. They're probably the most accurate thing left in my head." Miguel nodded, then made a decision that would change Walter's remaining years. "Colonel, would you be willing to tell your stories to someone who could record them? Someone who could make sure they're preserved?" Walter's eyes sharpened with interest. "What do you mean?" "I mean, there are historians, researchers, people who specialize in collecting veteran testimonies. Your memories aren't just personal stories. They're historical documents. They're evidence of things that happened, people who lived and died, sacrifices that shaped our country. Miguel pulled out his phone and showed Walter a website for the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. They collect testimonies from veterans of all conflicts, Miguel explained. Oral histories, personal documents, photographs. They preserve them for future generations, for researchers, for families who want to know what their loved ones went through. Walter stared at the phone screen, his mind working slowly through the implications. "You think my stories matter?" he asked quietly. "Colonel," Miguel said firmly, "your stories are the only record we have of what really happened to men like Jimmy Mitchell and Sarah Collins. If you don't tell them, if they die with you, then those people are forgotten forever." That afternoon, Miguel called his granddaughter aside and asked her to help him contact the Veterans History Project. Within a week, they had arranged for a historian from the Missouri Veterans Commission to visit Sunset Manor and conduct a formal interview with Walter. Dr. Amanda Foster was a military historian who specialized in Vietnam War testimonies. She arrived at the nursing home expecting to spend an hour with an elderly veteran, collecting a few anecdotes for the archives. Instead, she found herself in the presence of a man whose memory spanned 3 major conflicts and contained details that could fill gaps in official military histories. "Colonel Harrison," Dr. Foster said, setting up her recording equipment, "I understand you served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. That's quite unusual. Most veterans served in only 1 or 2 conflicts." Walter smiled at her surprise. "I enlisted at 17 in 1944, lied about my age to get in. Spent the last year of World War II in the Pacific. Korea started when I was a sergeant, Vietnam when I was a captain. Retired as a colonel in 1971. Dr. Foster checked her notes, doing quick calculations in her head. That would be 27 years of service spanning 3 wars. "Colonel, if your memory is accurate, you're one of perhaps a few hundred men who served in all 3 conflicts." "My memory is accurate, Doctor," Walter said with quiet dignity. "At least about the wars. The disease takes the recent stuff, but the important memories, those stay clear." Over the next 3 hours, Dr. Foster recorded testimony that would later be described as one of the most comprehensive first-hand accounts of American military operations in the mid-20th century. Walter spoke about D-Day beaches and Pacific Islands, about frozen mountains in Korea and jungle valleys in Vietnam. He named names, described specific operations, recalled conversations with men who had died decades ago. Most importantly, he spoke about the human cost of war, the friends lost, the families destroyed, the psychological wounds that never fully healed. People think soldiers fight for country or flag or ideology, Walter said toward the end of the interview. But that's not true. Soldiers fight for the man next to them. They die for each other, not for grand causes. Sarah Collins didn't die for democracy. She died for 12 wounded soldiers who needed her help. Dr. Foster stopped the recording and sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by what she had just heard. "Colonel," she said softly, "what you've shared today is invaluable. These stories, these names, these details, they're going to help researchers understand things that have been lost to history." Walter nodded slowly. "Then maybe some good can come from all the remembering. Maybe Jimmy Mitchell and Sarah Collins, and all the others won't be forgotten after all." Dr. Foster packed up her equipment, but before leaving, she had one more question. "Colonel, how does it feel to finally have someone listen to your stories? To have them taken seriously?" Walter was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the parking lot where his memories had wandered for 2 years. "Like I matter again," he said simply. "Like my life meant something. Word of Walter's recorded testimony spread quickly through the military history community. Dr. Foster's interview had been transcribed and cross-referenced with official military records, revealing that Walter's memories aligned perfectly with documented historical events. More importantly, his testimony contained details that weren't in the official records. Names of enlisted men who had performed acts of heroism but were never formally recognized. Descriptions of classified operations that had been expunged from public documents. First-hand accounts of events that had previously existed only in fragmentary reports. Within a month, Sunset Manor began receiving calls from historians, researchers, and military archivists who wanted to interview Walter. The nursing home staff, still adjusting to the revelation that their difficult patient was actually a decorated war hero, weren't sure how to handle the attention. Dr. Patricia Webb, the medical director, called a staff meeting to address the situation. "I want everyone to understand what we're dealing with here," she said, addressing the assembled nurses and aides. "Colonel Harrison isn't just a resident with dementia. He's a living repository of American military history. His memories may be some of the most accurate records we have of certain events." Sandra Morrison, the charge nurse, raised her hand hesitantly. "Dr. Webb, how do we balance his medical needs with all these interview requests? His condition is still deteriorating." Dr. Webb nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly the challenge we face. The Alzheimer's is progressive. Colonel Harrison's cognitive function will continue to decline. But paradoxically, his war memories may remain intact longer than other types of memory. We need to preserve those memories while we can, but we also need to protect him from exploitation." The staff implemented new protocols for Walter's care. Interview requests were limited to legitimate historians and researchers. Sessions were kept short to avoid fatigue. Most importantly, Walter retained the right to refuse any interview or stop any session if he became uncomfortable. The transformation in how the staff treated Walter was remarkable. Nurses who had once dismissed his stories now listened respectfully when he spoke about his service. Aides who had hurried past his wheelchair now stopped to ask about his experiences. Linda Peters, the nursing assistant who had once called Walter attention-seeking, became one of his most devoted caregivers. "I owe you an apology, Colonel," she said one morning while helping him with breakfast. "I treated you like you were making things up when you were trying to honor your fallen friends." Walter patted her hand gently. "You didn't know, Linda. Most people don't understand that sometimes the stories we tell aren't about getting attention. They're about keeping promises to people who can't speak for themselves." The most significant recognition came when Walter's son, Robert, finally learned about his father's recorded testimony. Dr. Foster had contacted him as part of her research verification process, asking if he could provide any documents or photographs from his father's military service. Robert had initially been dismissive. "Doctor, my father has Alzheimer's disease. He tells elaborate fantasies about being a war hero. I'm sure he's convinced you that his stories are real, but—" Dr. Foster interrupted him gently. "Mr. Harrison, I've spent 15 years collecting veteran testimonies. I know the difference between confabulation and authentic memory. Your father isn't telling fantasies. He's providing historical testimony that's being verified by military archivists." She emailed Robert copies of the official military records that confirmed Walter's service history, the dates, ranks, units, and decorations that matched perfectly with his recorded memories. Robert stared at the documents on his computer screen in shock. His father had been telling the truth. Every story Robert had dismissed as delusion, every detail he had attributed to a diseased mind, was documented historical fact. That weekend, Robert flew to Missouri for the first time in over a year. When he walked into room 347 at Sunset Manor, he found his father sitting by the window, looking older and more frail than he remembered. "Dad," Robert said tentatively. Walter turned slowly, his eyes taking a moment to focus on his son's face. "Robert," he said with a gentle smile, "you came to visit. Dad, I need to apologize." Robert said, sitting down beside his father's wheelchair, "I didn't believe your stories. I thought the Alzheimer's was making you imagine things about being a soldier." Walter nodded sadly. "It's hard to believe, son. The things I've seen, the places I've been, they don't sound real to people who weren't there." "But they are real," Robert said, his voice breaking slightly. "I saw the records. Dad, the medals, the commendations, the testimonials from other soldiers. You really did all those things." Walter reached out and took his son's hand with fingers that shook from medication and age. "Robert, I never told you boys about the war because I wanted you to have normal lives. I didn't want you growing up in the shadow of all that death and violence. But I never imagined you'd think I was lying about it." Robert felt ashamed as he realized how he had failed his father. "Dad, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you show me the medals, the documents?" "Because the medals don't matter," Walter said simply. "The important thing was the men who didn't get to come home, who didn't get to have sons and watch them grow up. I lived when they didn't, and that's a responsibility you carry forever." Robert spent the weekend at Sunset Manor, listening to his father's stories with new ears. He heard about Sarah Collins and Jimmy Mitchell, about frozen mountains in Korea and jungle valleys in Vietnam. He learned about the friends his father had lost, the soldiers he had saved, the weight of command decisions that had shaped entire battles. Most importantly, he began to understand that his father's stories weren't about glorifying war. They were about honoring the people who had paid the ultimate price for their service. When Robert returned to California, he immediately began reaching out to other family members, sharing what he had learned about his father's service. Walter's grandchildren, who had grown up thinking their grandfather was just a confused old man, suddenly saw him in an entirely different light. His granddaughter Sarah, a college student studying history, wrote her senior thesis on veteran testimony and oral history, using her grandfather's recorded interviews as source material. His grandson Michael, who was considering military service, visited Sunset Manor to hear firsthand about what military life really meant, not the romanticized version from movies, but the genuine experience of someone who had lived it. The attention Walter received also brought unexpected visitors. Other veterans, some from his old units, began making pilgrimages to Springfield to see the colonel who was preserving their shared history. One afternoon, a frail elderly man appeared in the doorway of room 347, supported by a walker and accompanied by his adult daughter. "Colonel Harrison?" the man said hesitantly. "My name is David Chun. I served under you in Vietnam. Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion. I heard you were here." Walter's eyes widened with recognition, and his entire demeanor changed. "Sergeant Chun, my God, you made it home. How are Mary and the children?" David Chun began crying as he realized that Walter remembered not just him, but his family details from 55 years ago. "Mary died last year, sir, but we had 48 good years together. 3 children, 7 grandchildren. I wanted to come thank you." "Thank me for what, Sergeant?" "For bringing us home, sir. For making the decisions that kept us alive when other units were getting torn apart. You saved my life more times than I can count." The reunion between the two veterans was emotional for everyone present. David Chun's daughter recorded their conversation, capturing the moment. When two old soldiers recognized in each other the bonds forged in combat. Decades earlier, these visits became more frequent as word spread through veteran networks. Men who had served under Walter's command, soldiers whose lives he had saved, families of men who had died in his arms. They all came to pay their respects to a commander who had never forgotten their sacrifices. The local American Legion post learned about Walter's presence at Sunset Manor and decided to hold a special ceremony honoring his service. On a crisp November morning, exactly 1 year after Jessica Martinez had first listened to his stories, dozens of veterans gathered in the nursing home's common area. Walter was brought out in his wheelchair, wearing a clean shirt and his military decorations, medals, that the staff had finally learned to treat with respect. The ceremony was simple but profound. The reading of Walter's military citation, the presentation of a flag that had flown over the Missouri state capitol, and testimonials from veterans whose lives he had touched. But the most meaningful moment came when Jessica Martinez, now a sophomore in college studying social work, stood up to speak. "A year ago," she said, addressing the assembled veterans and nursing home staff, "I met an old man who told stories that everyone said were fake. I learned something important that day. Sometimes the people society dismisses as burdens are actually treasures. We're too busy to recognize." She looked directly at Walter, whose eyes were clear and focused despite his advancing condition. "Colonel Harrison taught me that every person has a story worth hearing, that dignity doesn't depend on mental capacity, and that sometimes the most important histories are carried by people who seem broken but are actually whole in ways we can't see." Jessica turned to address the nursing home staff, many of whom were crying. The colonel's memories aren't symptoms of a disease. They're gifts. Gifts to his family, to historians, to future generations who need to understand what real service looks like. But mostly, they're gifts to all of us, reminding us that heroism doesn't end when someone gets old or sick. The ceremony concluded with the playing of taps and a 21-gun salute performed by the local VFW Honor Guard. Walter listened with his eyes closed, perhaps hearing in the familiar notes an echo of all the military funerals he had attended over the decades. After the ceremony, as the visitors began to leave, Walter asked to speak privately with Jessica. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what, Colonel?" "For listening, for believing, for seeing the man instead of just the disease." Jessica knelt beside his wheelchair and took his hand. "Thank you for showing me that sometimes the most important thing we can do is pay attention to people who think they've been forgotten." 6 months later, Walter's condition had deteriorated significantly. The Alzheimer's was progressing, taking more of his recent memories and making it harder for him to communicate. But remarkably, his warm memories remained intact, and he continued to share them with the historians and researchers who visited regularly. Dr. Foster published a book based on Walter's testimony, titled Voices from 3 Wars, the military memoirs of Colonel Walter Harrison. The book became a valuable resource for military historians and was adopted as supplementary reading in several university history programs. More importantly, Walter's story changed how Sunset Manor treated all of its residents. The staff implemented new protocols for learning about residents' backgrounds, recognizing that everyone who lived there had stories worth preserving and dignities worth protecting. Sandra Morrison, the charge nurse, started a program where volunteers would interview residents about their life experiences, creating recorded histories for their families and for the facility's archives. We learned something important from Colonel Harrison. She explained to new staff members during orientation, "Our residents aren't just patients with medical conditions. They're people with rich histories, valuable experiences, and wisdom that deserves respect. Our job isn't just to provide medical care. It's to preserve human dignity. Walter passed away peacefully on a spring morning, surrounded by family members who had finally learned to treasure his stories, and nursing staff who had come to see him as the hero he had always been. His funeral was held at the National Cemetery in Springfield, with full military honors. Hundreds of people attended, family members, fellow veterans, nursing home staff, historians who had recorded his testimony, and complete strangers who had been moved by his story. Jessica Martinez, now graduated and working as a social worker specializing in elderly care, delivered one of the eulogies. Colonel Walter Harrison taught us that memory isn't just about the past. It's about preserving the truth of people who can no longer speak for themselves. She said, "He showed us that sometimes the most important histories are carried by those society considers least important." She paused, looking out at the diverse crowd gathered to honor a man who had almost been forgotten. The colonel's legacy isn't just his military service, though that was extraordinary. His legacy is the reminder that every person, no matter how old, how sick, how difficult they seem, carries within them stories that matter, experiences that shaped history, and wisdom that deserves our respect. The ceremony concluded with the playing of taps and the folding of the American flag, which was presented to Walter's son Robert. As the crowd dispersed, many attendees lingered, sharing their own memories of the colonel, who had reminded them that heroes don't stop being heroes just because they get old. Dr. Amanda Foster established the Walter Harrison Memorial Archive at the University of Missouri, dedicated to preserving veteran testimonies and ensuring that the stories of men like Walter would never be lost to bureaucratic indifference or societal neglect. Sunset Manor renamed their common area the Harrison Memorial Hall and hung Walter's military portrait alongside a plaque that read, "In memory of Colonel Walter Harrison, who taught us that every person has a story worth hearing and a dignity worth protecting." But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from an unexpected source. Sarah Collins' niece, who had learned about Walter's testimony through Dr. Foster's research, wrote a letter to Sunset Manor that was read at the dedication ceremony. "My Aunt Sarah died in Vietnam 55 years ago, and our family had always wondered about the circumstances of her death. Thanks to Colonel Harrison's memories, we finally know that she died as she lived, helping others, showing courage, making a difference. More importantly, we know that someone remembered her. Someone honored her sacrifice. Someone made sure her story didn't die with her. Colonel Harrison gave my family a gift we can never repay. The knowledge that Sarah's life mattered, that her death meant something, that she wasn't forgotten. In preserving her memory, he preserved a piece of our family's history. I never met Colonel Harrison, but I know he was a hero, not just because of his military service, but because he understood that the most important battles are often fought in the minds and hearts of those who refuse to let the past be forgotten. Today, Sunset Manor operates under new principles inspired by Walter's story. Every resident receives a dignity interview upon admission, where staff members learn about their background, their accomplishments, their stories. These interviews are recorded and preserved, ensuring that no one's history is dismissed as irrelevant or unworthy of attention. The Walter Harrison Protocol, as it came to be known, has been adopted by nursing facilities across the country. It's based on a simple principle: respect for human dignity doesn't diminish with age or cognitive function, and every person's story deserves to be heard and preserved. Jessica Martinez, now Dr. Jessica Martinez, continues her work in geriatric social services, specializing in programs that preserve the oral histories of elderly patients. She often tells her colleagues about the day she met a difficult patient who taught her that sometimes the most important lesson healthcare workers can learn is the difference between hearing and listening. Colonel Harrison's story reminds us that Alzheimer's disease may steal recent memories, but it can't steal a lifetime of experiences, wisdom, and humanity. She explains to new social workers, our job isn't to dismiss what patients say as symptoms of their condition. Our job is to listen for the truth that lies beneath the surface. Miguel Martinez, Jessica's grandfather, passed away 2 years after Walter, but not before establishing a scholarship fund for students studying veteran oral history, the Miguel Martinez Memorial. Scholarship ensures that future researchers will continue the work of preserving military testimonies and honoring the thin sacrifices of those who served. The scholarship's mission statement, written by Miguel before his death, captures the lesson that Walter Harrison taught everyone who knew him. War veterans carry within their memories the most precious and painful chapters of our national history. As they age and face cognitive challenges, society often dismisses their stories as confused ramblings. But these stories are not symptoms of disease. They are testimonies of service, sacrifice, and survival that must be preserved for future generations. The courage required to share traumatic memories with strangers is no less than the courage required to face enemy fire. We honor both forms of bravery, and we commit ourselves to ensuring that no veteran's story dies unheard. Walter Harrison had entered Sunset Manor as a forgotten man whose stories were dismissed as delusions. He died as a recognized hero, whose testimony had been preserved for posterity and whose example had changed how society treats its most vulnerable citizens. His greatest victory wasn't any battle he had fought in 3 wars. It was the battle against being forgotten, against having his truth dismissed, against dying with his stories untold. In the end, Walter Harrison proved that memory is more than just a cognitive function. It's a sacred trust between generations, a responsibility to honor those who came before us, and a reminder that every person's story matters. The inscription on his headstone, chosen by his family, reads simply, Colonel Walter Harrison, 1929 to 2019. He remembered so we would not forget. Below that, in smaller text, are the names Sarah Collins and Jimmy Mitchell, 2 of the many people Walter had promised to remember, promises he kept until his final breath. Every Memorial Day, visitors to the cemetery find fresh flowers on Walter's grave, left by people who never knew him personally, but were moved by his story. The flowers are usually accompanied by small American flags and handwritten notes from veterans, nursing home workers, historians, and ordinary citizens who learned about the colonel, who refused to let his comrades be forgotten. One recent note, left by a young nursing student, captured the enduring power of Walter's legacy. Thank you for teaching us that our patients are not just medical cases, they are living histories, who deserve our respect, our attention, and our care. Because of your story, I promise to listen to every veteran I serve, to honor every story I hear, and to remember that sometimes the most important medicine we can provide is human dignity. Walter Harrison had fought his last battle and won his most important victory, ensuring that the truth of human experience would survive even when memory fails, that the stories of the forgotten would be remembered, and that every person's dignity would be recognized regardless of their condition. His war was finally over, but his mission continued in every healthcare worker who chose to listen instead of dismiss, every family member who learned to treasure instead of ignore, and every person who understood that sometimes the greatest heroes are hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to see past their circumstances to the truth of who they really are. Dr. Jessica Martinez stood in the newly renovated lobby of Sunset Manor, now renamed the Walter Harrison Veterans Care Center. The walls were lined with photographs and recorded testimonies from dozens of elderly veterans whose stories had been preserved through the protocols Walter had inspired. A young nursing student approached her with a tablet, showing a video interview she had just completed with a new resident. "Dr. Martinez," the student said excitedly, "I think you should see this. Mr. Thompson, in room 212, has been telling amazing stories about the Korean War. And when I researched his claims, everything checks out. He was part of a classified mission that's only recently been declassified." Jessica smiled, remembering her own experience a decade earlier when she had first listened to Walter's impossible stories. "What's the first rule of the Harrison Protocol?" she asked the student. "Listen first, judge never," the young woman replied. "Every story deserves to be heard." "And the second rule? Dignity doesn't depend on diagnosis. A person's worth isn't measured by their cognitive function." Jessica nodded approvingly. "Then you already know what to do. Set up a recording session with Mr. Thompson. His stories aren't just memories, they're history." As the student hurried away to arrange the interview, Jessica walked to the memorial wall where Walter's photograph hung, alongside dozens of other veterans whose stories had been preserved. Beneath his picture was the final entry from his recorded testimony, words that had become the mission statement for the entire facility. Asterisk, "I may forget what I had for breakfast, but I will never forget the names of the men who died beside me. As long as I draw breath, their stories will live. That's not a symptom of disease, that's the sacred duty of survival." Outside, spring flowers bloomed in the Walter Harrison Memorial Garden, where families often brought their elderly relatives to sit in the peaceful surroundings. A bronze plaque near the entrance bore a simple inscription that captured the essence of everything Walter had taught them. Asterisk, "In memory of all those whose stories wait to be heard, and in honor of those who choose to listen." The work continued. The stories lived on. And somewhere in the quiet corners of memory, the voices of forgotten heroes found new ways to be remembered. Veterans and military families, share your hero's name and one story they told you. Let's make sure no Walter Harrison is ever forgotten again. Their stories matter, and so do they. Asterisk, memory may fade, but the truth of a life lived with honor endures. Sometimes the most important battles are fought, not with weapons, but with words, the words of those who refuse to let heroes die unnamed and unremembered. In a world that often discards the elderly and dismisses the ill, the greatest victory is recognizing the dignity and worth that no disease can steal. Asterisk, this story is dedicated to all the elderly veterans whose stories wait to be heard, and to the caregivers who had the power to listen. Asterisk.